book discussion, The Guide by Peter Heller. It's a book about adventure. It's a book about action, criminal. It's a book about civil rights, the problems with unilateral pandemic-related state action. There's a conversation about guns and freedom. So this novel, while I would say it's more of a Netflix show slash movie action thriller, it has some depth in it. In particular, I think the question of how much can we trust the government. So it's kind of in the realm of the Unforgiven, Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman, that movie where it's a western, it's action, it's sex and drugs and rock and roll if you want, but there's a more deeper question of really how far can we go and to trust the government. So I think I want to discuss this particular aspect of the novel. There's a couple of other things, love as usual, celebrity, fame, freedom, all those kinds of things. But I want to focus on the civil aspects of the novel. Before I go into the conversation, just for new listeners, the purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. So why do we discuss books? Two reasons. One is we want to keep a record of what we're reading, but more importantly, books are not just a pastime of hedge fund managers. Books are the business. Reading books is as important as anything else you do because books are conditioning of the mind. Books are helping you get ready for the knowledge work that you have to do as a hedge fund manager. We're in the business of taking risk. We're in the business of anticipating the unexpected, of allocating capital to risk and all kinds of things that are intellectually challenging. This is something that, while it's a very old business, I would say it's one of the oldest businesses, maybe not the oldest, because people have always had the necessity to allocate resources to risky projects, even the Neanderthals and way back. But of course, we didn't call that hedge fund or whatever. We didn't call it during the Venetian times when they sent ships to bring cloth and spices from the East. They didn't call it hedge fund managers, but those people were doing the similar jobs like we do. In a nutshell, we are in the business of using our minds to make decisions, and that's where the reading comes in. It helps us condition our mind, formulate our thoughts, think about things, and therefore it's very important. This is Not Even Wrong podcast. It's July 12, 2022. This is Krim Zelko. For the year, we are down 43.5%. The market is down 17.7%. We're underperforming by 25.8%. Now let's get right into it. Peter Heller, The Guide. It's a book about a man who is hired to be a fishing guide somewhere in Colorado, and a beautiful landscape description. Peter is, I think it's a very good author when it comes to making it palatable to listen or read about landscape, but he's not a Dostoevsky or something, so he doesn't get lost in detail. I think he wrote this novel as a prelude to a script. This could become a movie. Think about Colorado, meadows, mountain valleys, creeks, rivers, and fishing. Fishing is a big deal in the Rocky Mountains. I can attest to that, having been up there several times. So it's a big deal, particularly on the west side of the United States. It's a tradition. So there's this guide. There's a very high-end, expensive lodge that caters to billionaires and millionaires and so on and so forth. And they go fishing there. So he is hired to go there and help people fish. The story starts unfolding and mysteries start happening. I don't want to give things away here, but it becomes pretty hairy. So Jack, the guide, he's now more and more cornered into a position where he either tolerates what's going on or he starts doing something. There's certainly something wrong. Something is wrong, and people are upset around him. There's people that are not talking. He knows that they could be talking. There's all kinds of mysteries. So again, this could be a very good movie plot. Fundamentally, though, what I paid attention to mostly is it is set in the backdrop of some sort of pandemic He even mentions the word COVID, but he doesn't necessarily talk about the pandemic that we just went through. But it's certainly a sort of an allegory, if you want. It's definitely alluding to the possibility that there is a pandemic. So there's a couple of things that happen. One, he's asked to give up his firearms. Now, this is a farmer. He's actually a rancher up in Colorado, and he has a gun like everybody else up there for various reasons, certainly not to go and shoot people, but to protect himself. The author goes actually way out of his way to explain, to formulate a personality around Jack that I think fits very well into particularly the western part of the United States, maybe the rural western part of the United States. It's a guy that spends a lot of time in nature, a guy that deals with animals, a guy that needs to protect himself against other animals, coyotes, mountain lions, and so on and so forth, a guy that likes to hunt, and a guy that also doesn't want to get into the crosshairs of other people. So that's why he has a gun. This is not a big deal. I think Peter is certainly putting out the message here that people can have guns and not be crazy, mass shooters. Nevertheless, he's asked to give up his gun, and this is the first time that you as a reader almost feel uncomfortable, because this lodge where he's working, while it's a high-end lodge, and we've probably all been to places like that, either as guests or maybe we just passed through. I just came from the Sundance Lodge in Utah about 6 months ago. Actually, didn't spend the night there, but I went hiking there, and I could imagine something like that, very high end, exclusive. Famous people go there, private. There's private hiking trails, guides, and all kinds of stuff around there. In the summer, you can go maybe fishing and hiking again, and in the winter, you go skiing and snowshoeing and that kind of thing. So coming to a place like that, I wouldn't be shocked if somebody, particularly somebody who lives in the mountains, wants to have his rifle and his gun with him. I mean, it's just a thing to do to protect yourself. And quite frankly, we urbanites, particularly people like me, having grown up in Europe and not being familiar with the gun culture here in the United States, it's probably even naive to go to places like that without being able to protect yourself. Now, I have a pretty good training in self-defense, boxing, jiu-jitsu, MMA, so I could defend myself to some extent, but certainly not against firearms. That's obviously very difficult without having a firearm. Now, he's asked to give up, and that's where I think the coin dropped to me, that this is a little bit like the Unforgiven, where Eastwood and his pals are asked to give up the guns, and the sheriff, Gene Hackman, then starts really, violating the law and harassing them, and then you start realizing that having a gun sometimes actually really serves your own protection. Now, it becomes a lot hairier than that, and there's another scene in the book where the pandemic is being used unilaterally by the sheriff of the county to basically separate people and make it impossible for people to talk to the outside world while they have good reason to talk to the outside world. Again, I don't want to give away the plot, but there's definitely a reason people want to communicate with the outside world, if not to uncover a crime, then at least to make sure that they're not onto something here that maybe later on they would regret. But then there's this unilateral decision that you can't talk to the outside world, that phones are being collected, that there's a lockdown, that you have to have a distance also from the people that you're around with, so you can't talk to them. And it just, to me, shows how dangerous this situation is, how slippery the path from public health protection towards a coerced, uncomfortable, if even life-threatening situation could be, where the government and government officials and bureaucrats and corrupt people just take over. And unfortunately, we've been there, we've seen that. We've seen that with bureaucrats in the United States and all across the world. They took liberties in their own hands. They did things that they weren't supposed to do. And I think Peter in this book shows that that is a risk and that we have to be aware of that. And I think this is the main message that I take away from this book. I think another thing that is very interesting here is also that there is the good and the bad. There's also this risk maybe of going too far with medicine, going too far with things like CRISPR and synthetic biology. And we've spoken a lot about the potential of synthetic biology, and we want to use this book here as a reminder, and this is a very good example of why reading is so important, like having read this book, it makes me think, look, we have to be careful with our CRISPR ideas and portfolio and all that kind of stuff, because look, there is risk. People can use this for bad things and so on and so forth. Now, our opinion here at Orange Capital Partners is that technology will progress no matter what we think of what our moral objections are, and that we are better off having mastering the technology than pretending that it doesn't exist and then let other people master it and then overwhelm us. So it's always better to be at the forefront. We're not against prohibiting technologies. We're not against making things not possible and then basically crowding out research to other places. That's not what we're advocating at all. But we are on the same line, like people of the what is it called, the Institute for the Human Future or something like that, where Max Tegmark is involved, and people, the Institute of Humanity or something like that. I forgot the name. I'll put it in the show notes. My point here is that we want to open the conversation. We want to have positives and negatives, and a very nice side note on Demis Hassabis's podcast with Lex Friedman was that he said when they worked on AlphaFold and all the potential ramifications of that invention that they are giving to the world, that they did spend a lot of time with ethicists and philosophers and all that kind of stuff. Not that they have an answer, but I think just opening the conversation, being sensitive to the conversation, that alone is a very good way to go forward. This is a Popperian way to deal with these problems, because what we want to do is we want to have a process of try and error, of iteration and error correction. So to summarize, the guy Peter Heller, an interesting book. It's not a very deep philosophical or literary masterpiece, by no means, but it's an interesting book. It's worth a movie. It opens two big points for me. One is the necessity to think about civil liberties and how we deal with things like the pandemic and when bureaucrats take over, and we have to be very careful about that. And also how we deal with when the state, let's say, takes away our right to carry guns. This is definitely not such an easy answer that maybe people like me that come from Europe often think that, well, it's easy, you just prohibit people from wearing guns. Well, who is wearing guns? It's the government. They have the monopoly on violence, and that's not such a good thing either. So we have to be very careful about that. And the second big thing that this book discusses is the ethics and the morals of synthetic biology that need to be taken into account and that need to be discussed. Thank you.